Now we come to Dr. Beate Pfeil. She will explain why the concept laid out in the two WHO documents, Pandemic Treaty and amendments to the new international health regulations, why this can lead to quasi-institutionalized human rights violations and or to a permanent undermining of the rule of law principle. Please.
Thank you. Dear members of parliament, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin with a quotation, which, however, must remain incomplete for reasons of time alone. Perhaps one or the other of you knows where it comes from. I quote, "We, the heads of state of government of the states, have assembled at a time of profound change and historic expectations. The era of confrontation and division of Europe has ended. The courage of men and women, the strength of the will of the peoples have opened a new era of democracy, peace, and unity in Europe. Ours is a time for fulfilling the hopes and expectations of our peoples have cherished for decades. Steadfast commitment to democracy based on human rights and fundamental freedoms." End of the quotation. Human rights and fundamental freedoms, indisputable core values of the states of Europe and the European Union. Has it been possible to fulfill the corresponding hopes and expectations in times of so-called pandemics? How are human rights usually implemented? Allow me to take a brief excursion into the doctrine that underlies the constitutions of the EU member states, as well as many international law treaties, such as the Council of Europe's European Convention on Human Rights, United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Charter of Fundamental Rights binding the EU and its member states when implementing EU law. All people are free from birth and are endowed with human dignity. The state, or even the EU, can restrict this freedom for the public benefit and must even do so in order to protect other people. However, while people can exercise their freedom as they wish, interventions in personal freedoms must be justified by the state or the EU. The principle of proportionality plays a central role here. Accordingly, interventions in fundamental rights must serve a legitimate purpose and be suitable, necessary, and appropriate to fulfill this purpose. Measures with reference to public health must thus include a risk-benefit assessment on the basis of genuine scientific evidence. This can only be achieved through a free scientific discourse involving all relevant scientific disciplines. In a democratic state under the rule of law, there are mechanisms to ensure proportionality and other principles that are intended to protect the individual from unlawful state encroachment. These include the separation of powers and a system of checks and balances between these powers. Furthermore, encroachments on fundamental rights should only be possible by parliamentary act, and their legality must be subject to constitutional judicial review. Now, what about the adherence to these principles at the WHO level? Assuming the planned amendments to the International Health Regulations, IHR, and the new Pandemic Treaty were to be adopted in one or another form and subsequently enter into force. And how does the European Union contribute to compliance with these principles, to which it is itself bound by the Charter of Fundamental Rights? Especially since the EU Commission was giving a corresponding mandate to negotiate the planned WHO documents by decision of 3rd March 2022. To answer the first question, let us imagine the following scenario. We are in December of the year 2025, a fictitious state X. There is an outbreak of a seasonal infectious disease and begins to make its rounds. Step 1. Through the close surveillance mechanism for infectious diseases, the information reaches the WHO Director General, who decides on the declaration and termination of a health emergency. Article 12 IHR. The Director General can choose from a now extended list of rather vaguely formulated diseases contained in Annex 2 of the IHR, and in the course of the so-called One Health approach, which was mentioned here before, also include aspects of animal, climate, and environmental protection. He can then declare an intermediate health alert or already a public health emergency of international concern, so-called FAKE. The declaration of a mere regional emergency is also possible. Formally, the IHR provide factual criteria for declaring and terminating such fakes, including scientific evidence and risk of international spread of disease. Also, the expertise of an emergency committee is available to the Director General. Now, suppose the Director General decides to declare a fake. Does this ensure that there is indeed a dangerous cross-border global health emergency that could justify certain measures? Absolutely not. The reason: there is no independent body which could check the decision of the Director General in advance and correct it if necessary. The emergency committee, like all expert committees mentioned in the 2 WHO documents, is in no way independent, is appointed by the Director General, and its recommendations are not binding. I just recall the case of the monkeypox. Even State X has no longer any say in the matter, and the Director General can make his or her decisions purely arbitrarily. Step 2. The Director General can now trigger a whole cascade of obligations on the WHO member states by means of now obligatory so-called temporary recommendations. I call them more appropriately emergency orders. And at the same time, he receives executive power with regard to their implementation. Conceivable obligations are drastic measures restricting fundamental rights, such as orders for vaccinations, tests and corresponding proofs, vaccination certificates, medical examinations and treatments, regulations for travel and trade restrictions, isolation and quarantine, contact tracing, and comprehensive so-called lockdowns. All of this is based on the Articles 15 and 18 of the IHR and others. Here, too, scientific evidence and proportionality are formally demanded, but here, too, there is a lack of independent review bodies that conform to the rule of law. Here, too, the door is open to arbitrariness and thus to worldwide, comprehensive, and massive human rights violations. In addition, there are allocation plans, production obligations, and financial obligations for the so-called health products and pandemic-related products being produced by the so-called non-state actors. What a strange terminology. especially vaccinations, whose effectiveness and principal harmlessness is thus already taken for granted. Due to the verifiable financial dependence of the WHO on the pharmaceutical lobby, this fact is highly explosive and above all suitable for sacrificing the actually inalienable human right to physical integrity to profit interests. Step 3 is also highly explosive, takes place in parallel and also independently of the existence of a fake. Here the aim is to combat so-called infodemics, another interesting word, consisting of too much, false or misleading information. At the same time, the population is to be specifically educated in the areas of science and public health and specifically guided in their behavior. We call this nudging. There will be an expert later on speaking about such kinds of patterns. The problem, as a rule, there are no incontrovertible truths, also in the field of natural sciences, and especially when it comes to the proportionality of freedom interventions, there is an urgent need for a constant and independent scientific discourse in the spirit of at least approximating scientific evidence. In particular, free and informed consent in physical interventions is only conceivable on this basis. However, it is precisely here that the WHO arrogates to itself an uncontrollable monopoly of truth, which threatens the freedom of science and teaching, the freedom of opinion and information, and the freedom of the media, and paves the way for comprehensive censorship. This undermines the social discourse necessary for democracy and the rule of law, as well as the scientific discourse and the role of the media as a further control authority for state power. Ultimately, the values and foundations of democracy and the rule of law are acutely threatened, and a dangerous form of totalitarianism is on the horizon. In sum, the new WHO rules establish a regime that creates a virtually insurmountable tension with the constitutional and international legal obligations of its member states, and thus threatens to undermine the principles of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. This is all the more so because the WHO is given quasi-legislative powers here through the binding so-called recommendations. In fact, they are orders, and at the same time acts as an executive which is equipped with conspicuously strict implementation mechanisms, potentially including sanctions, and which deprives itself of any independent control. This is capable of exerting immense pressure on the individual states, which, especially in the case of a fake, are thus left with virtually no time or leeway to remember their own constitutional rules of the game. And the latter has already become visible during the COVID-19 era, even without that pressure from the side of the WHO. The human rights violations and damages caused are already immeasurable, as the colleagues will point out. And the question why must still be allowed. In conclusion, I would like once again to give a voice to the governments of the OSCE member states, which also include the EU members, specifically in the 1990 Charter of Paris for a New Europe, supposing to usher a new era. I quote again, "Human rights and fundamental freedoms are the birthright of all human beings, are inalienable. Their protection and promotion is the first responsibility of government. Respect for them is an essential safeguard against an overmighty state. In which era are we currently? It is up to us, every single person, every person in positions of responsibility, whether at state or EU level, to make a decision. Let us speak out here and now against overmighty states, an overmighty WHO, and also against an overmighty European Union, which, as colleagues have shown, has already set itself on the path to establishing a WHO-like regime. The task is to prevent this in the interest of safeguarding hard-won European values, first and foremost human rights. Thank you.